Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fielka. Today's August 13, 2024. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast. I'm probably wrong about everything. Please subscribe. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Ronan McDonald, Part Two. Where in the heck are you calling in from, Ronan?
I'm in Melbourne again, where I was for Part One. Thanks very much for having me back.
Truly an honor. I hope this becomes a 8-part Netflix series. You are so generous. So, what was the tipping point for you to pursue writing and educator? I mean, those are the two things you do basically, right? You're a writer and an educator.
Yeah.
So where in your life are you studying this in high school and grade school or grade school, high school and college? Go, that's what I want to be. Or is there a tipping point for both of those, writing and educator?
I don't think there was. There was no Damascus moment, road to Damascus moment. It was a. I was as a teenager. I think probably like a lot of people on your show. People are interested in books or reading or academics or writers. You probably. I was definitely a reader. I was interested in ideas. I was interested in communicating them, from early teenage years on. And but I didn't have any ambitions to be. Certainly, I didn't want to be. An educator. I don't think I had much. That wasn't certain. Maybe nobody really does dream of becoming. Not many teenagers dream of becoming a teacher. My goodness, it's not that glamorous, really, is it? Now I value it very much. People do dream of becoming a writer, and there's the romance of being a like those guys in Paris drinking absinthe and hanging out in the garret and all that. But to be a teacher, be an educator, second or third level, is not really the stuff of dreams. Though perhaps it should be, because I think in some ways the most important work I do is educating, and it's a great privilege to do so. So as I've got older, I value that side of what I do more. I think it's a rare thing to be able to have access to young people and introduce young people to literature you love. When did it occur to me? I would say not until during my PhD or after my PhD did I have ambitions to follow an academic path as an educator. And I've always liked teaching, but I think I have come to value it more and more. As to being a writer, I guess that was earlier. I always wanted to be involved. I always wanted to read and to self-improve and to be absorbed in an intellectual world. And I was fortunate enough to be able to find a way of making a living doing that. So that was kind of a no-brainer.
So you mean you made a living being a writer before you became an educator?
Yeah, well, to my mind, being a writer and being a reader are very conflated. And the particular sort of writer that I'm doing, I'm not a fiction writer or a poet. I am a writer of criticism and intellectual history, and hope sometimes higher journalism. And so I see that sort of writing, in other words, part of the circulation of ideas, thoughts. I see that as kind of a world that I'm involved in, rather than as distinct from a world of art or creativity. It's not a firm distinction, but I think so. But I think in all cases, to be a good writer is to be a good reader. I think the two are very, very allied.
But Ronan, at some point you're reading people, we'll get into Joyce a little and Becca, but you're reading people and you go, oh, I can do that. That's what I'm talking about. The tipping point, like you're in high school, you're reading and then you go, oh, I can do that. Or you just start writing from what, there's some point where you go, I can do this.
Yeah, I probably had vague notions that I would do it. When did I start? Before university. But I would say it was not a sudden epiphany. It grew. And then I said, I like this and I'm good at it. And I have an opportunity to pursue funded graduate study in a good university. I'm going to take this. But even then, I didn't think, well, obviously, this is a path to being a writer. But then I found that and did more and more, and pursued a career which involved what we misname research. I think in the humanities, not really
Right.
research. But what might be better named is what it used to be called, which is scholarship and criticism or critique.
Well, that's just the point too, is who are you reading like Harold Bloom and go, oh, I can do this? Or are your teachers telling you, okay, go write this paper on this subject, and then they give you a good grade and you go, oh, I'm a good writer. I mean,
I think it's a bit of both. I think that
yeah,
that there is the the reading and production within the institution and within the prescribed forms of the institution, and then reading what other people have written and people you admire, and then there is your own innovation and finding your own voice, your own critical voice. And as you get older, you never escape from an institution if you're in academic, and there's a certain mode of writing you have to do. But within that, I think that you take ownership over the writing you're doing, the scholarship you're doing, and feel a degree of creativity within it.
right. So here's McLuhan let's do this one first. Two McLuhan things. Marshall says everything we invent extends some humanness. Knife and fork extends our teeth. Shutter and a camera extends our eyelid. Maybe even philosophy or religion, non-tangible, extends consciousness. What does the writing utensil extend for you? Whether it's a pen or a keyboard, what humanness does it extend?
God, every time you quote Marshall McLuhan, I want to go back and read him. He's so proleptic. He's so.
What's that word mean? I've never heard that word.
It means like he anticipates. He anticipates what's coming. He's so enduringly relevant. It doesn't seem dated.
You said predictive?
Proleptic, proleptic, proleptic. Because that sort of concept just resonates a lot with what we're now calling post-humanism and the blurring of the distinction between the human and the non-human, which a lot of people in the humanities are writing about. But he was writing about that many decades ago. That kind of cyborg image of the knife and fork being an extension of our bodies. And you're saying it's an extension of the human. And I guess, yes, that's one way of seeing it. It's also perhaps a blurring of the human and the non-human in that concept. So to answer your question, what part of the human do I think writing extends? I mean, I think it's hard to see it as an extension of only one faculty, the way a knife and fork extends the hands, because writing seems to me to encapsulate so much of experience as broadly understood. I mean, if you read a certain sort of prose, descriptive prose, it activates your senses.
Yeah.
Or poetry. Okay, so if you're reading a certain sort of writing, it activates your senses. So you can have an almost bodily reaction to a certain sort of writing, but other sort of writing you have an intellectual response to, or an imaginative, or a sympathetic one. So all the various facets of human experience, human imagination, human feeling, human connectedness, interhuman connectedness, and I suppose that's really the ethical dimension of writing, what it extends, our imagination, our fellow feeling. I mean, I'm old-fashioned enough to have some belief in the idea that literature may be good for our capacity, for our imagination and our capacity to put ourselves into the shoes of another. So in that way, maybe what we're thinking about, I'm kind of thinking as I'm answering here, in that way, maybe when we think about, because my initial answer to your question was, well, is it extending the human, or is it blurring the human and the mechanic? Perhaps it's not so much. One thing it does is not so much breaks down distinction between human and non-human as to open up the interhuman, to open up the capacity for humans to connect. So there's a kind of a it breaks down our experience as monads and allows us our sense of ourselves as totally autonomous, i.e., isolated, and allows us to communicate. I mean, I think language does this. All language does this. It allows us to connect to others, to imagine what it is to be others, to share ideas, to communicate with others, and then creates lines. So what bit of the human does it connect? The communicative aspect, and thereby puts us in touch with other people who are having the same thoughts or ideas or feelings or pain that we have.
Yeah, Ronan's so good. Yeah, I interviewed a Dante specialist who's a poet in Italy. I says, "What does the writing utensil extend?" He goes, "Tears." You know, and so you're kind of thinking it doesn't have to be a physical thing. It can be non-tangible, and that's when I say, "What does the movie extend for people?" They go, "The eye or memory." And McLuhan says, "No, the movie extends your foot because you're traveling." But he wasn't about laying it down and saying it's one thing. He just send these probes out and see what comes up. He wasn't, because this inner human to connect is one thing he said that's amazing is technology is the most human thing that why are we putting something between me and another person? Spoken word, gesture, food, prepared food, whatever we're putting between each other is making us connect with another human being. In fact, who's the guy? Jean Rouch, the French documentarian film theorist, he says, when I put a camera between me and you, it's more true than when there's no camera. And so that's like, why do we have to put these screens between us or these words between us? Because we invented them, we're hopefully doing that. But that's funny because there's one other thing you evoked was the flip of McLuhan. If you want to read a couple good things to read, is McLuhan's 2 pages on Burroughs. That's amazing because it's something. I'll send you the link.
And I know I've read that. Okay, that's good.
It was in Nation magazine. It's just like, a throw off article he did, but it really, because it's, and then the Playboy interview is pretty good. But the one is Narcissus as Narcosis, which is in Understanding Media, which is a total reinterpretation of narcissism. It's not that we fall in love with an image of ourselves. We fall in love with the mirror, the tool. And we don't realize what it does to us. We shape our, what he ripped off, he reworded Churchill by going, Churchill said, we shape our buildings, then they shape us. Okay, that's pretty good. Marshall just said, we shape our tools, then they shape us.
I wonder, I wonder what he would say about our smartphones and social media. Because you mentioned narcissists there, and the whole way that kind of amplifies certain.
Well, there's a lot. He's touched on that. But the best thing I ever heard was, if Marshall was alive today, he would have a website, and he wouldn't tell anybody what the URL was, so you couldn't go to it. But here's the flip on the narcissism. I learned this new word in the last couple of years through Carolyn Casey: biomimicry. So humans see this plant that's Velcro. It's not really Velcro. It is the plan for Velcro. So the human sees how the plant does this, and they go, "Oh, I can synthesize that and make it out of plastic." So we look to nature to, like, we see beavers build a dam. Maybe it teaches us how to build a dam. So we look to nature. So we biomimic nature. So that's like almost the opposite. And we extend some humanness, because you call it post-humanism. Yeah, Marshall, that's the funny thing. He's really misinterpreted, but he is talking about things that could happen in the future, because he got everything he knows from Finnegan's Wake and The Symbolist. He was a literature guy, so he gets his picture. He gets his picture on the cover of Newsweek magazine as the TV guru. It's like, he's not it. But he go, oh, I'll take it. You know, he just went along with it. But here's the 57 in a book called Classroom Without Walls. You know, Museum Without Walls. There it is. It's misleading to suppose there's any basic difference between education and entertainment. This distinction merely relieves people of the responsibility of looking into the matter. It's like setting up a distinction between didactic and lyric poetry on the ground that one teaches and the other pleases. However, it's always been true that whatever pleases teaches more effectively. So if you could jump into that a little, what's the difference between education and entertainment? And then these key lines, whatever pleases teaches more effectively.
I'm very interested in that concept, not least because I'm currently, well, just at the in the very foothills of a new project on attention. And the concept of attention and what attention is and how it's been understood by critics and thinkers. And I know McLuhan has a lot to say about attention in directly and indirectly. And it seems to me, I mean, obviously we hear a lot about attention at the moment because of the commodification of attention with you know, social media and so on. But one of the challenges for us as educators is to hold attention. It's funny how we use metaphors for attention, to hold attention. And most of us, you know, people talk, for example, about the but as you know, as creative people talk about the desirability of what psychologists call flow.
Yeah.
And flow is simultaneously being learning and being absorbed, or creating and being absorbed. So the only way, I mean, we can find a lot of other concepts between entertainment and education, but the idea of being absorbed, being engaged, being with non-coercively involved in something is, I think, a necessary platform for good education. Now, how you achieve that, because I think we do have, like, you know, in terms of the history of attention and history of education, we have this idea of coercive, you know, sit up straight, focus. It's a kind of a military type discipline. We have this idea of attention and discipline on one end. On the other hand, we have an idea of, as a teacher, let me get down with the kids and start every lesson with some reference to video games or something they love. Let's simply mirror them back. And I think both those are mistakes as educators. I think that the challenge is to find, because people are interested not only in mirrors, but people are interested in difference and adventure. Yeah. You've got to make it seem like an adventure which involves, absorbs, and, to use a more dangerous word, enchants. You know, enchants. With what you're presenting, but it has to be not reinforcing what someone is interested in or believes, or going with perhaps habitual pleasures, but perhaps with luring. I mean, there's a seductive aspect to education. I think, you know, there's and perhaps that's another thing which links entertainment and education. We talk, after all, about carnal knowledge, don't we? There's a knowledge in the erotics, but the erotics of education is also about pulling someone into something new. Seduction should be entertaining as well as educative. So I think that there is I'm very interested in that way of thinking together entertainment and education, both as in theory, but also in practice. Because it's a real challenge in the classroom to, you know, most classrooms now are a losing battle between the PowerPoint and the smartphone. The PowerPoint on the stage, and the student with the smartphone underneath the screen.
Yeah, Ronan, check this out. Sorry to interrupt, but PowerPoint was banned by the Pentagon because it's too effective.
Really?
Yeah,
Okay.
because so that's like, no, you want me and you communicating now. I feel I'm getting your eye contact and I feel we're both present. But
Yeah.
as soon as people's eyes go up on the screen, it's too effective, and then you lose the humanity of the teaching process. But the two other quick things is that's what happened to McLuhan. He gets his first job teaching in St. Louis, and he can't get their attention to teach them Poe and poetry. So he writes his first book about advertising and comic books. So it's
Right.
exactly what, oh, I'll be hip. I'll talk about video games. And, I talked to one of the greatest video game directors the other day, and he's totally into Joyce. And he realized you play video games, you play music.
Mm,
That's a key. You don't you don't play literature so much. You work at writing. So
mm.
did you did you get any classes on how to be a teacher in front? Did you learn how to teach by watching all your other professors all your life? Or did they go, oh, here's a class, Ronan, where we'll teach you how to teach and get their attention?
I guess a bit of both. Um, when I probably the class thing, the teaching of the teachers. Um, you know, the old unfair George Bernard Shaw line: "Those who can do,
Yeah,
those who can't teach." You hear that
yeah,
one? Those who can do
yeah.
can't teach, and those who can't teach teach teachers, which is somewhat just to some extent what academics do. A lot of our students become teachers, but so I don't know what that makes people who are teaching academics. But since I've been employed by universities, there have been us teaching methods, teaching us psychologists, teaching us how to communicate, giving us ideas, and sometimes that's useful. Sometimes it gives us
Yeah,
thoughts. Um, but I find I'm a little suspicious of the effort to homogenize teaching practice, to
yeah,
make it into a product. And it's all about the model of the university as precisely a commodity and a product which has to be
yeah,
the same everywhere. My
yeah,
own most memorable teachers taught in a way and I think the best teaching, like the best writing, has its own signature. It's sui generis, and it uses the teacher's
yeah,
personality, and it can't really be taught. And I think most people would say that. I think most people, when they think back and say, "What's the best classroom experiences?" It's often by an individual who was inimitable, eccentric, uh, um, and takes them on an unpredictable journey. It's not somebody
yeah,
using the latest kind of bite-sized methods of learning, giving students a learning experience that can be packaged. But of
yeah.
course, universities more and more want to make it packageable, homogeneous, commodified, and predictable. To
Yeah,
my mind, and I think predictable is the most important of all, because I
yeah,
really feel
yeah.
that what happens in a classroom, a little bit like what happens in this interview, should be unpredictable.
Yeah, it's like this guy who's considered one of the greatest experimental filmmakers, James Benny. He teaches at Cal Arts, and one of
Mm,
his assignments is go sit in the lobby of a police office. Just sit in the
mm,
lobby. Well, what does that have to do with filmmaking? Yeah, you're going to
mm,
observe people being
mm,
busted or getting processed. But it's funny because most people I ask this, Ronan, say no, they never taught me how to teach. They just
mm,
said, okay, teach. And so
mm,
that's good that you learned that and you could express that. But
mm,
one person reacted. Most people go, whatever pleases teaches more effectively. So you can learn as much from education as you can from entertainment. That's what he's sort of applying, whatever
mm.
pleases. So everybody kind of agrees. Then one guy goes, no, whatever displeases teaches more effectively. So, I
Mm.
mean, you're not going to lay stuff on people, your students, that displeases them, maybe because that's going to alienate them more, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I mean, is entertainment the same as pleasure? I
Yeah,
would say no,
I see. Yeah, that's a good distinction.
because I think we're sometimes entertained by discomfort. That's why
Yeah,
people go on roller coasters or
yeah,
watch horror
right.
movies at the kind of the most basic level. But I think like we don't unless you're a masochist look for pain.
Yeah.
But there's a sense in which being opened in an artistic experience, having a sense of vertigo can be um, can mix pleasure and pain or discomfort. And I think certainly, yes, I recognize that it has to be involving, absorbing to be effective, to be remembered, rather than just utterly alienated and distant. But I
Yeah.
have some sympathy for your interviewee who said that what displeases, because I think that growth, any sort of growth, and I think education is a form of growth,
Yeah.
involves discomfort. Growth is about breaking through things.
Oh, yeah. Really good, Ronan, because here's Michael Apted 40 years ago, the filmmaker. I asked him, why do rock video editors feel so obliged to edit fast? Most people don't know Abel Gance invented rapid montage in 1922, but it flourished in the 80s because of MTV, to the point where Marty Scorsese says, hey, I cut my films faster because of MTV. So Michael
Mm.
Apted said, because we've learned to take in information faster. So I asked this question with a bias. Can we literally learn to take in information faster? Or are we just brainwashed to believe we can?
Um, I I think my intuition here is that speed comes at the cost of depth. I think that if we want complexity and nuance and shades of grey and ambivalence and ambiguity, which used to be, a literary virtue or considered literary virtue. I'm thinking of people like William Empson's book, Seven Types of Ambiguity. Um, we need to slow down in our reading. I don't feel. I mean, I feel certainly that there's a real velocity to how we absorb things, but I think that that velocity is inimical to depth and complexity, and that's worrying.
Yeah. Is it literally possible to multitask?
Um, I think multitasking, what people call multitasking, is sometimes a misnomer because people who this is supposedly something that women do better than men. And I've observed women supposedly multitasking better. What they do, and of course, both sexes multitask, but it's doing one thing in a focused way for a short time. Okay.
Yeah.
The problem is that people think multitasking is doing things simultaneously, and that's often just having your focus moved across different domains quickly, and that can leave you, like a rabbit in headlights, or a movie just drifting side to side. Whereas effective multitasking are people who can change focus from doing one thing at a time quickly. So that's what I think multitasking is, and I think we can multitask. You can train yourself to multitask under pressure. People multitask, but I do think that it comes back to what I said about speed is at the cost of depth. Um, it's hard to do. It's hard to kind of burrow into anything if you're being continually distracted from it.
Yeah. I wanted to go back because you used the word ambiguity and ambiguous in part one. And I love those two words because I have a line.
Mhm.
I'm ambiguous about ambiguity. But what's the motive of the cave artist? Your guess, your hunch.
the mode,
Motive.
the motive of the cave artist. Um, My guess, my hunch. I I suspect that the roots of art are in some way shared with the roots of religion. So I suspect that the cave artist is, again, anthropologists might know more about this. I'm able to give it evidence for this, but I expect that the motive to represent experience on a wall is linked in some way, quite often linked in some way, with our sense of the sacred. So it's why we often, it's often images that we find a way to revere, those products of human culture. So when you ask me to guess, I think that there's often an incipient idea of the sacred in the creation of cave art.
Very good. Two of my film heroes have a mantra. George Manupelli says, ignore yourself. Jonas Mekas says, there is no self-expression. And Cecil Taylor, jazz pianist, says, I'm just a vehicle and this stuff just comes through me. Is art making more self-expression, or more you're a vehicle for whatever technologies, cultures, and environments are dominant?
I think it has to be both.
Yeah.
I don't like either pole of that. I don't like the idea of that we're all completely self-originating, separate from the network of which we were talking about earlier. Of course, we're molded by forces that are beyond us, and those forces speak through us. Whether those, forces are cultural or spiritual, or the idea of the genius as some sort of a cipher. But nor do I like the idea that we are automatons caught up in purely deterministic systems. So I think that we are nodes in a network, and we kind of process all the information coming in, but we have some agency. I don't want to deny us our agency in what we do and the choices we make and the creations we make.
Can art making be egoless?
I'm thinking of artists who might broach ego altogether. I suspect that's very rare. I think ego usually comes in to artistic expression, even if that's an ego molding materials which are outside the self and inherited.
Yeah,
there's a I think I've recently been working on writing an essay on Joyce and modernism, and there's a lot of accounts of modernism which talk about it in terms of, well, this moment in culture makes this inevitable. It makes this innovation inevitable because of the asymmetries between industry and ancien regime, and unevenness and uneven development. And I'm thinking, okay, yeah, those are all the cultural forces. But if you read Joyce, and if you look at the way Joyce thinks about art and writes about art, because a lot of his work is self-reflexive, there's an awful lot of ego in it, an awful lot of strategizing, individual strategizing, sharp elbows, looking for space within the world literary field. That I think that to ignore that is kind of to erase agency. So I think that ego, I think it's often there, perhaps in a way in which we're uncomfortable with quite often.
Yeah.
But I think egoless art is probably white. It's probably the a kind of a mystical sort of state, which is silent. And maybe you might find it on the edges of Beckett, which kind of looks to evacuate the ego a lot, or to kind of shed the self. But other than that, I think you find that I don't think it really, I think probably in our tradition anyway, and what we call art in the West, probably does need ego.
Two great answer, because most people go, no, it can't be egoless. And one woman about a year goes, great art is egoless. And then another woman a couple months later said, great art has to be egoless. But it is beautiful, because I was hoping you would touch on Beckett there a little, because he almost appears egoless. And then
Yeah.
back to Joyce, he says, I didn't write Finnegan's Wake. The people sitting over at the coffee house wrote it. And I just listened to it and wrote it down. But the question is, how these other musicians get their sound from their environment. One of my favorites is Missy Elliott, the rap star, that goes, how'd you learn how to sing? She goes, from car alarms.
I love it.
So
Brilliant.
it's not like the gospel church where you usually learn how to sing. She says, I lived in the ghetto and the car alarms taught me how to sing. But
That's lovely. There's a fascinating bird that's local to where I live here in the hills outside of Melbourne called the lyrebird. And the lyrebird, I don't know if you've ever heard of the lyrebird, but the lyrebird is this perfect mimic. So you hear them all the time reproducing the sound of a chainsaw. Or the sound of whatever it's heard, car alarms. It just reproduces it. So it's kind of discomforting to hear this talking about human, non-human, post-human.
Yeah, that's biomimicry.
Yeah, biomimicry for you.
That's it. But I wanted to go into this because Dante said, hey, I pray to the muse to aid me, and then here's Milan Kundera, Unbearable Likeness of Being. This is why I love writing, because the character that I'm writing about can go further than I can. Well, that sounds mystical. That's romantic and it sounds good, but how you write the character with your pen and then it goes further? Yeah, right. But I mean, it's not any thoughts on that line. And you're saying cave arts rooted in are shared with religion. And then Dante's saying, I pray to the muse. And then Kundero's almost flipping it, going, oh, yeah, it can go further than I can. Like, yeah, right. How?
Yeah. There does seem to be something. I mean, the muse is so interesting, isn't it? There does seem to be something, and it brings us back to the to your Kundera, to your Marshall McLuhan idea of the pen being an extension.
Yeah,
because you could kind of see the muse as a kind of an extension. There's a kind of prosthetics, if you like, about creativity, in which you kind of need the machine, even if that machine is configured as a sort of a muse, to come to your aid. Muse is like an inspiration machine.
Yeah.
I think that's more accurate than the idea that he can go further than I can on the Kundera line.
Yeah, because that's funny, because it's a little funny that Marshall McLuhan converted to Catholicism, but whatever. And there's a whole book called The Medium and the Light where he talks about religion and they took his writings and gathered it. It's not his book while he was alive. But one of my teachers taught me, McLuhan converted to Catholicism as a performance art piece. And so he would say, well, electricity is that muse. That's the hidden ground in everything. With Joyce, he was talking about the radio and the TV, and there's the hidden ground is you couldn't have radio or TV without electricity. So, and then, we tried to study electricity once, and it's not a human invention. We learned how to harness electricity. We didn't invent it. Yeah. So then it's like, here's poet critic Helen Vendler, just to go off on this cave art motive for a second. I write to explain things to myself.
Yeah. I like that. I like how Helen Vendler just died a few months ago.
Yeah.
And she was a great critic, great poetry critic, and a great interpreter of Yeats. And one of her virtues, which is particularly admirable in the study of literature over the last few decades, is her astonishing lucidity. And so when she says I write to explain things to myself, and you read her close reading a Shakespeare sonnet or a Yeats poem or Wallace Stevens, there's a sense in which she calmly and with a certain humility, I think, adds lucidity. She sheds light. And there is and this perhaps contrasts with what we were saying about ambiguity, because I feel that my appreciation has been enriched after reading her, because she has unpacked and unraveled the things that my reading practice flits over. And I think there's a role for that as a critic. So when she's saying she writes to explain things to herself, it makes sense in the literary critical mode that she adopted. And she was, I suppose, the last great close reader. That's the tradition she was educated in.
Yeah.
And it's a noble tradition in literary criticism, in my opinion, sometimes much maligned tradition, but one that has offered a lot. And there was a kind of serenity in the way she unpacked and unraveled and explained how things worked. So yeah, I mean, I think writing to explain things to myself. I guess I'm relating that quote to her work. But I do think more broadly, I would say, and I say this to my students, you only know that you've understood something when you write it, when you write about it. So I think in that more general sense, the adage pertains. And I think that's one of the qualities of one of the points of writing is to focus the way a camera focuses a blurred object. It unblurs it through the act of articulating and expressing it. And that's why the distinction, which I think my undergraduates, I sometimes have between the argument and the writing style, is a false distinction. Good arguing, good thinking, and good writing are indistinguishable.
Beautiful. And here's Steve Martin quoting David Mamet all the time. Art is a product of the unconscious mind. Now that sounds, again, that's romantic, but Helen's the opposite. She's not. She's very conscious.
Yeah, she is. It is, but I mean, I guess maybe that's a distinction between the sort of writing she does, the critical writing she does, and the poetry she's writing about, which does seem often outside the frontal cortex, conscious creativity. There's a sense in which something is bubbling there. Images, Yeats would call it the anima mundi, the spirit world, which is perhaps a shared unconscious, a Jungian unconscious, if you want, rather than the Freudian one. And I think certainly a lot of images and symbols bubble in up to the surface in the poetry of a Yeats or a Wallace Stevens or which, well, you can say it comes from the conscious mind if you want to adopt that model of the psyche. It certainly comes from places which are not, well, I just said frontal cortex, which are outside the rational or the didactic.
Here's Louis Bersani in his study of Mallarmé. The very crises which threatens the writing of poetry sustains poetic composition.
Yeah, that seems to me to be profound and true.
Yeah.
I think that's right. I think that's quite often why a lot of great poetry is fueled by moments of cultural transformation, civilization transformation, crisis. Not only public poetry, not only poetry which engages overtly with moments of political crisis, but I think that when you're seeing, the feudalism mutate into Renaissance humanism, that kind of fracture between what use a Foucauldian word, the epistemes, often produces creative volcanoes.
Yeah. Creative volcanoes. You're a wordsmith, my friend. That was beautiful. So, my friend says the 3 T's of music are technique, theory, and taste. So, technique, you learn how to do it. Theory, the structure. How does one acquire taste? But I'll set it up so we can go off into this world. Breck asked Charles Lawton, why do you act? He says, because people don't know what they are like, and I think I can show them.
Hmm.
And then Igor Stravinsky says, most people don't know what they like what they know. So,
Hmm.
you have taste. You gravitated towards these great writers, Beckett and Joyce, and all the other ones you quote.
Hmm.
Why did you grab? Yeah, how do you acquire taste? How did that happen?
It's a really interesting concept, the concept of taste. I guess I kind of see taste. On the one extreme, you have the kind of populist idea of taste. Well, give the people what they like. Give the people what they like. Always satisfy what people are looking for. So let market decide everything.
Yeah.
Which is obviously embraced by very, very commercially driven creative enterprises for obvious reasons, because it's money making. The other one is, well, on the other side, might have a kind of cultivation, the idea of you cultivate taste. So if you cultivate taste, it will create everybody who only likes the so-called highest art. And I think that the second idea, the idea of the concept of cultivation, or Bildung, as the Germans would call it, is deeply unfashionable. But I think that it is I think taste can and should be cultivated. I think not all opinion about art is as good as the another. I think for somebody who is absorbed deeply in film, and for example, and knows it and is able to read the genre and therefore knows what innovations are being used, will have an opinion that is more worth listening to than somebody who doesn't have that and is just interested in pleasure and immediacy. So I hold to an old-fashioned idea of taste, but I don't think it is the case that when people are kind of develop a taste, that everyone has the same taste. I think the tastes are different, and to some extent, the role of the critic, or used to be the role of the critic, or the role of the educator in exposing or developing somebody's taste, somebody's really cultural literacy in a particular art form, is to help them understand their own taste.
Yeah.
Become so taste, how we receive literature culture, is a little bit like how we create it. We talk about creation in terms of finding one's voice. You find your voice in as a writer or as a filmmaker, and that's kind of your own signature. And the more confident and accomplished you become, the more clear your voice is. I think one finds one's taste too, and that is equally becomes distinctive and sui generis, like a signature, as you learn the form that you're seeking to opine on, or that you're seeking to appreciate. So I think that that's my understanding of taste, is something that the more you learn about an art form, the more you get absorbed in it, the more you read it, the more, the clearer, the less blurred your own taste becomes. So you know your own mind.
Yeah. Ronan, so good, because you brought up so much for me to reflect on. One was, we talked a lot about identity in part one. I love that. And I don't know if I said this, but Alan Watts says, everybody's trying to figure out who they are. If you figure out who you are, you're fucked. Because
Yeah.
we know what he means. But this understand your own taste. You can go along and say, oh, I like this, but why do I like it? But just to go back, I was having an intellectual discussion with a guy who I says, where'd you studied medicine. Where'd you go to school? He goes, in the oldest school of medicine in the world in Italy. I goes, oh, really? And he goes, do you know the movie La Dolce Vita by Fellini? I goes, yeah. He says, I lived La Dolce Vita. And then the next day I was thinking, well, what would have been a good comeback line? I should have says, well, do you know the movie Dumb or Dumber? I lived. I've never even seen Dumb or Dumber, but I thought it would have been a good comeback. But McLuhan said the future of the book is the blurb. So here's USA Today, which is reducing the great tradition of the American newspaper, which another great McLuhan thing is you can't write the great American novel because the great American novel is the front page of the newspaper. So when I go to check my email on AOL, I get these headlines. That is the great American novel right in my face. And it's a blurb, and it's like the future of the book is a blurb. So there's USA Today when they did the big literature 25 years ago, the big literature survey. What's the greatest book in the world? And the headlines of the newspaper said, Ulysses, greatest book ever. Huh? It had the word with a question mark. So let's just jump into Joyce for a second because
well, I'll just tell you a little sign I saw in a bookshop in Dublin was doing the rounds. In a bookshop there was a sign saying shoplifters will be made to read Ulysses.
That is good because the most stolen books are by Charles Bukowski.
Is that right? Oh,
yeah.
Wow. That's fascinating.
So what does epiphanies and everydayness mean to you? What do you think Joyce meant? You and Joyce. What's that term? Finding epiphanies and everydayness.
Well, it's an interesting, really Catholic word that Joyce, as he often did, rejigged for literary aesthetic reasons. But I think he probably there. He another word he uses epicleti when he was writing Dubliners, and of course critics have ever since kind of read the epiphany as the moment of sudden realization in which growth happens. A little bit, it looks back. I think this is true for Joyce. It's true for, I think, my experience of life too. But it looks back to what we were saying earlier about growth.
Yeah,
growth comes. It doesn't come in a steady personal growth or any other sort of growth. Doesn't come in a steady line. Often it comes in spurts, and often it comes. And if there's a psychological growth, sometimes it comes suddenly. It comes in a moment of revelation. And Joyce used those moments of revelation to structure his fiction, I suppose, first in the short story. But I think the short story as a form often relies, and certainly Joyce didn't invent the idea that the short story ends on a moment of epiphany or in revelation or insight, which is different from the idea of plot resolution, because often plots aren't resolved in Joyce, but they're not resolved in life either, are they? You don't find neat ends closed off, but there are moments in life, often moments of great discomfort, where truths get revealed. Yes. Often those are the sources of regret. When you realize what you've lost. Or when you realize perception, when you perceive things. So I think there are shafts of illumination. Beckett talked in his essay on Proust about the distinction between, I think he probably got this from Schopenhauer, because he nicked a lot of Schopenhauer when he was writing his essay on Proust in his 20s. But he talks about the distinction between the boredom of existence and the suffering of being.
Yeah.
And guess what? Those are the two choices. It's not a good deal. But the boredom of existence is how we usually live, and then shafts of illumination, or the suffering of being, which is I kind of understand or I read as a sort of epiphany, or where the artist lives.
Yeah.
Where those again rifts, those in the plates of the like where you live, around the edge of a continental plate, is where that kind of moment when you get the shafts of illumination, the suffering of being, a realization of condition from which creativity and authenticity comes. So I think epiphanies are a bit like that.
Yeah. Is Finnegan's Wake true?
Wow, what a great question. What an immense question. And I would have to, is Finnegan's Wake true? Yeah, look, I mean, this, you were talking about your esprit d'escalier moment with the Le Dolce esprit d'escalier, no,
Yeah.
with the Dolce Vita guy. I suspect with these interviews, I might have a bit of l'esprit d'escalier about some of the answers I'm giving. But I think that my first instinct is to, true, those big words which make us unhappy. Isn't that a line from Ulysses? But I think that if art isn't true, that has to be. I'm Keatsy enough. Truth is beauty. Beauty is truth. It has.
Yeah.
If it's not true, if it doesn't offer us some reality, then what's it doing?
Yeah.
It has to have some truth-bearing capacity, even if that is bombarding and complicating and democratizing and scrambling what we might inherit as our concept of truth, as some sort of shimmering eternal light outside culture. But yeah, I think it if it's Finnegan's Wake true, yes, I think in an absolutely fundamental sense, it is utterly true.
Yeah.
It is more true than it's shimmeringly true, and that's its worth.
Like I said, I ask questions and I want to hear a certain answer, but I welcome anything, and I don't say you're wrong, but I love it when somebody says, yeah, okay, how much percentage you get the Wake and how much percentage did Joyce get the Wake? I know it's stupid, just quickly, from 0 to 100%. How much do you get it and how much did Joyce get it?
I am not sure the percentage works for the Wake, because it suggests that the Wake is simply about a finite
Right.
codes that you can decode, and you run it through the reading machine, and we're reading machines, and then eventually in a couple of years we'll have an AI and we'll go, brilliant, we've solved Finnegan's Wake. It's 100% decoded. And look, it's obviously there's a lot of decoding to be done in Finnegan's Wake, but there's much more co-creation going on in Finnegan's Wake.
Much more. But I mean, just that's what I'm saying. Just, I know I want you to tell me a number, but just tell me a number. I know you don't want it, but just tell me what do you think? Just off, because I'll compensate why the stupid question was asked.
I'll give you how much did Joyce get when writing Finnegan's Wake? I mean, it's very hard for for me, Dan, to give you a number suggests the concept of what Finnegan's Wake is doing that conflicts with my understanding of what it's doing. So you want me to give you a number? How much do I get? How much does Joyce get?
Yeah,
Joyce gets 5%. I get 2%.
All right, that's good. Yeah, because I always say McLuhan broke the Finnegan's Wake code, and people go, "Nah, nobody broke the Finnegan's Wake code." That's why it's great. But this guy, we should do a salon on Beckett and Joyce. Corey, he's going to like Stanford, and he wrote a book on something that I put in one of my lectures once, that the English secret police studied the Wake. And then U.S. government studied the Wake to invent MK Ultra, the mind control.
Wow!
And I mean, it sounds like kooky conspiracy, but there's, he's studied it all and shows you, what you got to do with the PhD.
Mm,
So it's funny because, I think anybody who delves into the wake and doesn't go, oh, Ulysses is great, but he went too far with Finnegan's Wake. I don't get it. That's fine. But the people who do attempt to study the wake at all get it
mm,
100% because
mm.
it's ungettable. So
Well,
I
yeah.
mean, you're up in the 90% by just saying it. But most people say, I get it 50% and Joyce got it 90%. A lot of
Mm,
people don't say Joyce got it 100%, you know,
mm,
because
mm,
so anyways, here's portrait. I will try to express myself in some mode of life or art as freely as I can or as wholly as I can, using for my defense the only arms I allow myself to use. That's where McLuhan got it. Extend the humanness.
mm,
I
mm,
use the arms: silence, exile, and cunning. How
mm,
do you suss those three words out? What do they mean to you, and what do they mean to Joyce?
mm.
Silence, exile, and cunning.
Um, Before I answer that, I think I love the 100%. I get where you asked, and of course, I think that's right. I was kind of holding on to a concept of percentage as decoding. Doesn't need to mean that at all. And of
Yeah,
course, everybody gets it 100% because
who's
once you
into it?
realize it's not to be got,
It's
it's
not
not
to
what
be
it's
got.
about. It's not to be got. It is to be appreciated in a way which isn't about understanding or decoding. So I love that. Better
But
answer than mine.
it is gotten by somebody like Murray Gell-Mann, who takes a word out of the wake and
Yeah,
puts it into science. Because I want to go into art and science for a second
yeah,
if we can eventually. But it's like then you go, oh, what's so good about the wake? Well, a guy used one of the words for science. And they're like, oh,
mm,
well, it must be good.
yeah.
You try, how to legitimize the wake. Like I hit on a movie star once in a bookstore. And I said to her, have you ever read this book? And she goes, no. I says, it's unreadable. And she turned to me and she goes, what's the point? And my friend said, you should have said, well, to satirize the sensory overload we're living in.
That would have done the trick, I'm sure.
But
Um,
yeah,
yes,
silence,
silence,
exile.
exile, and cunning.
Yeah.
Um, Interesting. You've just the discussion earlier um, has made me focus on that word arms, which obviously means our arms, an extension of arms, but also has um, the military sense of arming and
Oh, yeah.
yeah, and armory, and that coming from perhaps that kind of combative sense of the prosthetic extension of the human is there
Yeah.
too from the start.
Yeah.
That's what armor is, and combative, but also defensive armor as
Yeah.
well as force of arms. So, but in portrait he uses the word arms, doesn't he? So in silence, exile, and cunning, uh, I think that in a discussion we touched on Joyce yesterday earlier about the question of ego, and I was saying Joyce is so strategic and present in the way he's creating, and so aware of the literary and cultural and social field, and is always navigating like Odysseus around to work his way through those. So there's a cunning involved in strategizing. Again, a military word, isn't it? To have strategy. And both aesthetically and culturally, it seems to me that Stephen Dedalus, James Joyce, in this case, I think that it's true for both, though there shouldn't always be conflated, is thinking strategically and making space for himself and his own cultural outlook, his own creativity in a kind of a literary world which is often cutthroat, dangerous, oppressive, both at home and abroad. And I think that's where the exile comes in.
Yeah.
He has to leave an Ireland which is uh, culturally and socially inhospitable in some ways, partly because of the dominance of, because of its colonized mindset, both colonized both by Britain and also by a dominant and authoritarian church. And he goes away, goes to a metropolis. Well, he goes to several cities around Europe, from which he has that distance. And I guess that's an inverse of what we've been talking about up till now in relation to the art, that maybe we need to kind of give it its due. Exile implies distance and distanciation, and the distance you need to. We've emphasized connection of the human with the non-human, the human with other humans, in the creative process. But there's also a need for exilic distance. Joyce goes away and writes about Dublin all the time. Nothing else. He writes about everything, but through the means of Dublin. So the cunning, I'm going backwards through the two: exile, the cunning, the exile, and then the silence, I think, is related to the other two, but is also, I think, encoded in by a certain expressive tact. I think we see that tact very, very manifest in Dubliners, which we talked about a second ago. He talks about Dubliners as written in a style of scrupulous meanness, in which, I mean, the short story as a genre often relies on the unsaid, the gestured at, the shown, the realities which aren't, the emotional realities and truths and psychic experiences which defy elaborate verbal representation. And I think that silence, that tact, is wired through Ulysses too, and perhaps also through The Wake, because, like, we often think of the Ulysses in The Wake as these huge, majestic cathedrals of expressing everything, but they're also, and at the same time, it seems to me, gesture towards the ineffable all the time. Things are left unsaid. There's an aware, and this is perhaps something that's at the heart of modernism, 20th century modernism. It is at once epical, profoundly hubristic in its intention to express a culture, but also aware, often painfully aware, of the ineffability of the world around us. So it braids together expressive ambition with silence, tact, reticence. There's a massive amount of reticence and unsaid in Ulysses too. That's part of his creative. It's a chiaroscuro, I think, between light and darkness, between expression and silence. So silence is always there in the work, including, I think, in the Wake, and precisely by the kind of polysemous qualities of the words and the portmanteau words and the neologisms in The Wake, that kind of reveals how meanings are always shadowed, a little bit like dark matter in the universe. You know, the dark matter, they're what matter. That's silence in Joyce's work.
That's so much there, Ronan. It's such a pleasure. I really appreciate what you said. It reminded me of at the end there, the resonating interval, the in-betweenness. And, you know, the symbolists got it from Poe. You know, I'm only going to tell you so much. I'm not going to tell you everything. And then that distance you talked about is media fast. So I was lecturing to art students once, 40 kids. I says, everybody in this room has a cell phone, right? And one girl goes, no, I don't. I goes, what? She goes, oh, I lost it. I says, well, you're a perfect example. You've lost it. You're going to get it back in a week, right? How has that made you feel? She goes, I have clarity.
Oh,
what an amazing thing that she could tell us a hidden psychic effect of being without something. And then a media fast is, were you forced to fast from it, or did you do it on purpose? Because that's like Cage, the word silence. John Cage wrote the song 433, where there's no music, you know, you only sit at a piano and you don't hit the keys. And Frank Zappa says a great line, mocking Zen. He says, nothing is what I want. And that's sort of like Beckett. people go, what's this play about? And it's like, nothing. Well, that's maybe a misinterpretation, but that's what most people say silence is sort of a nothingness. But indeed it is something. But it's funny, it has a paradox. Like, we can't explain nothingness unless we have a word for it.
Yeah, it's a real paradox, isn't it? Yeah, to name it sort of makes it something. Yeah.
That's love thy label as thyself. Again, back to Joyce. So here's another one that I would love for you to comment on. Welcome, O life. I go to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience, and to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race. You actually brought up smithy in the soul part 1, and we sort of covered that, the reality of experience. But it's that last phrase I'm curious, especially the uncreated conscience of my race. What do you mean uncreated? I mean, our value, and you brought up values in part 1. Values and morals are uncreated. Is that what is conscious of my race? He's taking possession, my race, the uncreated conscious.
Yeah, it is. The first thing I would say about that very famous line from Portrait is that it could be a little bit satirical on Stephen. I mean, Stephen, we tend to think of him as Joyce. But Stephen can be turgid, and it has a kind of bloated quality and self-regarding quality, that line. So we could read it as a satirical of this rather self-important, pompous 22-year-old getting ready to leave Ireland. But that said, let's see if we can pick it apart. I mean, the uncreated conscience, conscience is a word that evokes Hamlet. Conscience will make cowards of us all. And usually the line in the hit Hamlet's to be or not to be speech. And we know that Stephen Dedalus bears a lot of comparison with Hamlet. Perhaps insofar, one thing they bear in mind is actually neither of them are particularly effective doers. And this is perhaps grist to the idea that it's satirical. Stephen doesn't create much, either in Portrait or Ulysses. The bad villanelle in Portrait doesn't create much. And there's a sense in which he's often explicitly aligned with Hamlet. And I think even Nietzsche's idea of Hamlet, because Nietzsche's idea of Hamlet is a figure burdened with self-consciousness, too reflective, too caught up in intellection and ideas and illusions to have the necessary spontaneity for action. So I think that's definitely very deliberate in Joyce's hand to make Stephen perhaps suffer from Hamlet's surfeit heaviness of awareness and self-consciousness. So I think it alludes to that. But in Hamlet's case, it's also consciousness. So it's both I think it evokes both. Conscience is something connected to ethics or morals or an awareness of ethics and morals, but also consciousness. Then we go to the word uncreated, which is extremely I've just bearing in mind what I've just said about the fact that neither of them are very creative. Yeah. But it is the fact that he's saying the consciousness is uncreated indicates to me a theme that runs throughout Portrait and indeed Ulysses against inheritance. He doesn't inheritance in all its forms. By that I mean the idea that identity comes from paternity as both literal, but also as a synecdoche for a bigger sense of how we get identity, how we get consciousness. From nation, for example, that we inherit our identity from our fathers, but a father understood as a trope of parenthood. It's not biological, it's not cultural and inherited. Therefore, it's not determined. It's not deterministic. It's open. So I think that he's thinking about consciousness as something that is to come, that is created rather than inherited. The idea of, the other line, the word there, which is possibly its meaning has shifted in contemporary in our society compared to how Joyce is using it, is the word race.
Yeah.
Uncreated conscience of my race. He uses race several times in Portrait. Often, and it's not biological race. It's not what he's thinking of the way we have it now. It's kind of a toxic word now, racial thinking. He's thinking, he could be thinking about Ireland. Certainly other moments in the text when he uses race. For example, earlier in chapter 5, Davin, his friend Davin, is coming home from a hurling match. It's Irish nationalist Davin, and he encounters this woman whose husband is away, who invites him in. He calls her a creature of her race. And there's a sense in which the nation, the undiscovered nation. So this could be kind of Ireland is uncreated because it is yet to revive or come out from these forces that are dominating it. So that could be an uncreated conscience of a race. It could be kind of identified Joyce as a very complex descendant or participant in the revival, in the Irish revival, which is about inventing a nation, coming up with a post-colonial Irish race, Irish nation. That could be there too. I'm interested also, there's another line in, or it could be, the race of artists, outside the nation altogether. So I think it's suggestive in a number of ways. Elsewhere in the same episode, he talks about the nets. He says there are nets thrown at a man to hold him back from flight, the nets of nationality, language, and religion. I shall try to fly by those nets, he says in the line. So that would reinforce the idea that he's trying to escape determinism, inheritance, that you're kind of, you're born into a role, you're born into an identity, into a position, and your characteristics, your conscience is not a matter of your control. So he's trying to fly by the nets of nationality, language, and religion. But there's a real ambivalence in that word by, because it's not just bypass, it's by means of nationality, language, and religion. So it's not just that he's getting out and having a complete avoidance of his cultural inheritance. He's using the means around him, namely, of course, what else does he use but language to write? He's rewiring and rejigging the nets to turn them into wings, like Icarus, like Icarus and Daedalus, like Daedalus does in the labyrinth. He creates wings to fly. So the by is a reference to his name. Icarus is Daedalus's son, who famously flies too close to the sun, and the wings melt and he falls. And there's long been a critical debate about whether we read Stephen as Daedalus or Icarus. But the point here is that he's canny enough, and maybe this is a question of the cunning we spoke about earlier, to realize that our culture and our codes are things which trap us, because they're all created by other people, but they're also the means by which we escape the determinism which we're caught up in. Yeah. So in that respect, uncreated.
Really good. It also evoked W.C. Fields was reading the Bible, and they go, dude, why are you reading the Bible? He goes, I'm looking for loopholes.
I love it.
And that's what I always say. I'm looking for loopholes reading Finnegan's Wake. But you have to clarify. I love this word, but I'm not sure I got it right. Did you say nets, N-E-T-S, or nest, N-E-S-T-S?
N-E-T-S. So in the episode you quoted from and asked about the couple of questions about the uncreated conscience. That's episode 5 of Portrait. A little bit earlier, there's another really famous line. You asked about it. Well, there's another famous line in Silence, Exile, and Cunning. But another, the third one is when I'm going to give the quote from memory. I might get it wrong, but Stephen is talking to one of his friends, and he says, "When a man is born in this country, there are nets thrown to hold him back from flight. The nets of nationality, language, and religion.
Oh,
I
that's
shall strive to fly by those nets. But the
yeah.
crucial word there is the preposition by, because by
Bye.
means to bypass, to get around those nets, but it also means by means of.
Oh,
So,
wow.
I think I think I'm relating that sentiment, trying to
Yeah.
bypass, but also by means of, in relation to the word uncreated
Yeah.
in the quote you asked me to comment on, because
Yeah.
I think the by means of is precise. The nets are those forces of paternity,
Yeah.
determinism, identity that kind of trap us. But he's saying we bypass, not by pretending or imagining that we can escape the cultural air we breathe, but rather we turn those nets into the means of our liberation. Because if you think about what Joyce did with nationality, language, and religion, well, most obviously language. What did he do with language? He didn't escape language. He completely exploded it and
Yep.
changed it, and
Yep.
used it as, rather than a force of oppression, a force of emancipation, liberation, expression. But I think you could say the same thing about religion. We started talking about Epiphany, and
Yeah.
how he uses the inherited religion that he found institutionally oppressive as a way of understanding the role of his role as an artist, as a way of structuring what he does, his use of transubstantiation as a metaphor for creativity. And then the last one was that's religion, and the last one was nationality. Well, yes, he's trying to escape from nationalism as some sort of a an ethnic, exclusive, self-conscious, assertive identity, such as we see in some of the figures like the citizen in Ulysses. But at the same time, he's writing about, he uses his nation and the concept of the nation, his city, more particularly, as the subject of his art. So bypass and by means of, by scrambling, adulterating, rewriting, owning, unstitching the nets and turning them into wings, like Daedalus.
So well put. And I was going to ask you, what made James Joyce a unique writer? DNA, environment, upbringing, what? And you kind of covered that completely right there. But he did say at one point, I'm applied Aquinas, which caused McLuhan, they go, what are you? And he goes, I'm applied Joyce.
Ah, love it. Brilliant. I didn't know
Using
that.
that
That's a
line.
great
So
quote.
yeah. So how does that work? Applied Aquinas. Did you already just cover that, or is that?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, that's a very interesting admission by
Yeah.
Joyce. Not a surprising one. Entirely consistent
Yeah.
with lines like in chapter 5 of Portrait. He calls himself a priest of the eternal imagination. Possibly, again, it might be both satirical of Stephen, but also having some truth in the way Joyce understood himself. And we continually get your mind is super saturated in the religion you say you no longer believe, is another
Wow.
line said to Stephen. We have Mulligan talking about he has the cursed Jesuit strain in him, injected the wrong way around. So we get continually the idea of Stephen, very self-consciously and I think overtly, that his mind is and his imagination and his artistic and his creativity is structured by this Catholic education, even if evacuated of doctrinal or dogmatic content. I think that seems that's a critical truism about Joyce, that he's kind of a priest-like figure. So yeah, a lot of Thomism. It's full of Thomism. So applied Aquinas makes sense and is consistent.
Ronan, the other thing you taught me that I just rejoice at is Ellman saying we're learning to be Joyce's contemporaries. Now,
Yeah.
there's two ways. Yeah, but since you told me that, I added this whole new question, and I
Mm.
was like, holy moly, because both Joyce and Zappa say all times are happening now. That's all at onceness, and
Yeah.
that's like simultaneity. So that
Mm.
sounds good, Artists, Wyndham Lewis, artists live in the present and write a detailed history of the future, like be here now, live in the moment. All times are happening now. That sounds cosmic and all, but yeah, we know, hey, we've been doing this for almost 90 minutes, and I don't know if you can go much more time, but we're ruled by time.
Yeah.
So that I wanted you to, if you could, suss that out. Is that Ellman saying we're learning to be in Joyce's time and time travel and go back and live that moment? Or are we learning to believe, to understand that all times are happening now, or both? I mean, any thoughts on that, sussing out what Ellman said there?
Well, I think a lot of people, and you surely feel this, with your in-depth reading of The Wake, a lot of people often feel unnerved, record feeling unnerved by by the way Joyce's texts seem to anticipate what's going on.
Yeah.
You pick up The Wake, or you pick up Ulysses, and something gets thrown open, and it just seems relevant to contemporary society. And I think, we look at, in a very obvious sense, this is happening with The Wake in relation to technology and AI and hypertext and all those things. But I think there's a kind of an eerie prophetic quality to a lot of Joyce's work, and it's a line in Ellman's biography which a lot of critics have kind of highlighted. And now, whether that's Joyce or the texts, because the texts are so polysemous and operate in so many different ways. I mean, wasn't it Pound who said art is news that remains news?
Yeah.
Which kind of is a different angle from the same thing. You probably pick up a lot of really enduring literature. Seems fresh. It seems fresh and relevant to the situation that we're in. But then the deeper point you make is kind of, well, all art is about the existing and ongoing now. And that's just a totally different way of understanding temporality. But it's one with a lot of profundity. And I think, we think about eternity, a word which occurs in Ulysses. I am walking into eternity on Sandymount Strand, says Stephen Dedalus in Proteus episode. Hold to and then a little bit later he says, hold to the here and now, through which all future plunges to the past.
Yeah.
That's a line from Scylla and Charybdis, I think. And so we get this idea of the present, but isn't the idea that eternity is now? That's a kind of common idea in mystical thought across various traditions.
Yeah.
That you meditate and you actually find, if the being in the moment in an utterly true way is opening up to a sort of eternity, I think that's something that we find in the Eastern traditions, and it's so I think that's probably there at some level too. So there's different ways of understanding temporality, many of which are there, many of which conflict in Ulysses.
Yeah, Ronan, I asked for 90. Can we go a few more minutes and then?
Yeah, sure. I got a few more minutes if you want to go on. Yeah.
And then hopefully we'll do part 3, because I really want to get into Beckett, and you're just such a generous teacher. And this goes along with the last thing. And, we read a line in The Wake on page 12. We may see and hear nothing. And one of our members is in Brazil, Decio, and he says, eye is space, ear is time. So, this is what Joyce sort of did. What McLuhan called sense ratio shifting. He shifted the eye experience of reading into the ear experience of hearing.
Yeah.
And so this Thomas Jackson Rice in Cannibal Joyce, he maintained most of the dialogic relations in The Wake, all variations on the war between antithetical principles represented by Sean and Shem, eye and ear, space and time, are unresolved.
Mm.
And so this, then in studying him further, I learned that the Incas regarded space and time as a single concept. They call it
Mm.
P-A-C-H-A, Pancha.
Pacha. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Mm.
you go into, Chris Marker, great filmmaker, says, how do we escape time? And Dante, my friend, says, what's so great about Dante? He says he eliminates time and space. And you've
Mm.
got to go beyond time and space. So I don't know. And then the universe is both eternity and infinity. So I mean, I
Mm.
don't even know how to form my question, but it is this: is there a difference between time and space? I mean, is Sean the eye, space, and Shem is the ear, time? And how does that relate to this all times are happening now sort of thing?
Yeah. Um, well, I mean, we see the distinction between space and time is signaled by the start of Proteus, when Stephen is thinking, the bit when people stop reading Ulysses, ineluctable modality of the visible, and then he goes and thinks about ineluctable modality of the audible, and he
Yeah,
thinks about visible as being a way of organizing perception according to space, and
yeah,
audible being one organizing according to time. But I think one of the allusions there is to Gottfried Lessing, if my memory serves correctly, where he's kind of alluding to kind of German philosophy, which is organizing. Well, visible is about space, audible is about time, but it's an attempt to structure and order perception according to those things. And if those distinctions play out and get dissolved in the wake too. But various, I mean, these are perhaps questions that will be, how do we understand? This is a question for either advanced mystics or advanced theoretical physicists or psychedelic drugs, in which you can kind of understand the seeping together of space and time, and the fact that these things are to some degree, well, are they illusions? Are both space and time illusions? We
yeah,
know that what does it mean to talk about the beginning and the end of the universe? We know that time started. What does it mean to time? What's it mean to say that? It stretches our head to kind of, you talked about infinity and the eternity being the same thing. But I do think, that there is these ancient wisdom of the moment. Eternity is not about living forever and ever and ever or being in time. It's actually occupying the single moment properly. Um, so these questions are mind bending, and Joyce does engage with them, and they seem deeply connected with what consciousness is, if we can capture it, because our consciousness is related to space and time too, isn't it?
yeah. That's why I thought of all people you would know the answer when McLuhan says, "How about art as the collective unconscious and technology as the collective unconsciousness?" And it was like I've been trying to figure out that for years. And you brought up so much that, and again, helped me so much. But here's one more. Joseph Conrad. This was a guy in the Wall Street Journal last week. His ambition, as he created in the preface to his story on about the ship Narcissus,
Mm.
was to recreate and intensify reality, and by the power of the written word to make you hear and to make you feel. It is before all to make you see that and no more, and it is everything. It's a little jumbled sentence, but it's basically he's doing that sense ratio shifting. You don't hear the written word,
Yeah,
the power of the written word to make you hear and to make you feel, and and before all to make you see. Do you
yeah,
see what I'm saying? That's like,
yeah.
wait,
Do you
you're
see what I'm
shifting.
saying? Lovely.
You're
Yeah,
you're shifting. And my friend, I asked him, what's the difference? He goes, I'm not into binaries. And I mean, that's the essence of it all. So, I mean, maybe in part 3, we can dive into Beckett, but also go into the difference. What's the difference between art and science? That's another one. But why don't we close out this part? Ronan, thank you so much. Is perception reality?
Part of it. It must be part of reality, isn't it? Just to say that it's reality, illusion. Certainly perception is our phenomenal reality as we're living it.
Yeah.
It isn't to say that our perception corresponds with a priori truth,
yeah,
as the philosophers say, at all, but it certainly feels like reality when we're living it. If we perceive a rock hurtling towards us, and the rock, we perceive it hitting us in the head, and our head starts feeling pain, that's a reality for us. So, so it's part of reality, part of truth. But there's much more to reality than what we perceive immediately, and that seems to me to be underwritten both by art and science.
Yeah, but when I asked my friend, "Is perception reality?" He says, "That's all you got."
Yeah.
I mean, but Lily Tomlin nailed it. She says, "Reality is just a collective hunch."
That's nicely put. Nicely put. Yeah, I like that.
Thank you so much, Ronan. It's really
Thanks,
been
Jerry.
it's so generous of your time. It's like a master class, man.
No, I love your quotes. They're always want to write them down. I'm going to make sure I've got a good pen.
I hope you well schedule part 3 months down the line, but I hope you watch not film before that so we can delve into Beckett a little. The 2-minute trailer for the Beckett, Hollywood having someone play Beckett. Your take on that,
Yeah, Gabriel Byrne's a good actor, so maybe he'll do well. I'll have a look at it. Okay, thanks a lot, Jerry. Have a good afternoon. It's morning here. Have a good afternoon. Take care.
Thank you, Ronan.
Bye.
Appreciate it.